Hey guys, Chris Dick here. So today I'm going to expand on my user services video series. This will be part 8, and what we're going to do today is expand the API controller. We built a company's controller the last time, and what I want to do now is build a generic company's controller. We're going to take all that code and port it into something much smaller and a lower profile code base that's up on the parent. So what we have here, when we think about our company controller at the moment, it's using it handles its entirety within its own code base here. What I want to do is move out most of that code into something more generic and just pass up anything that needs to be handled by a company's controller itself. In other words, something that's very specific to the company entity. I want to pass it from the generic up to controller, company's controller, and have it handle that by itself. So let's take a look at what we have to do here. Now, the first thing I want to do is add an API file or class, if you will. It's going to be just simply an empty API controller. I'm going to call it base API user controller. And we're going to go along with this user notion with all of these controllers. Inevitably, what we're aiming for is something that any of those user entities can be strictly managed by these controllers. Otherwise, you can build specific controllers around the entities in your data set that may not require user objects or user security, let's call it. So with this, there are a few things that I can port over from the base user context that or user controller that we created in a couple of videos ago. Pretty much all of the features of the base user controller can be ported over. Further, I can do the same with the user controller. So I'm going to do that right now. Let's take this and we're going to, and you notice here I'm not keeping these attributes because in fact the base controller at this point really doesn't need to know anything about whether it's an API controller. It just does what it does. So with that in mind, we're going to make a few changes. So we call this API user controller and base API user controller. There's just a few very small corrections that we have to make. So basically we have the code that we need. Let's just go grab a couple more things that it's complaining about here. We're going to just get the constructor and a few of those variables at the top. And here we have it. So essentially what we have right now is the foundation of our base API user control. Now, when I look over at the what the view does, it's essentially what we need. We don't need a whole lot of extra stuff to make this work. I can take the repository code and the set code, so we'll just reuse some of that. Now you may be thinking, why are we just copying and pasting code? Well, you certainly could build a even deeper base generic controller if you like, but because these two controller sets can function slightly differently, I like to have them separate. And yes, I may have to manage two code bases, but that's not a great leap, considering that you may have very large applications that if you had to manage, let's say, 30, 40, 50 endpoints, it gets pretty hairy. And of course, if you're working with 30 or 40, 50 controllers individually that do all kinds of different things, it can be really difficult. So once again, these generic controllers are super helpful. And again, if you're managing the common functions between them, I think you'll be okay. So let's move down to here. We're going to look at index. Now, the equivalent of index in the context of an API is our get function. So HTTP get, and I call that get, in fact. Now, some of the things that we have to think about in get. We experienced a cyclic redundancy in the last video when I was demonstrating APIs. Now, with that, what we have to do is we have a couple of things that we're going to allow for modification of the entities if the controller is calling it. So in other words, if company controller is calling into our get function and it needs to modify that, in other words, do that select statement. Let's just go over to company's controller here and show you exactly what I mean. If we have to do this, we have to select it. Well, in a generic sense, we can't do that. There's certain features that we could do because ID and user are all available to us because we are using our iUser entity, but that's the only things that are available to us. So I could select it on those things, but that may not be right for every instance. In other words, I should be able to get an ID with no parameters, no requirement to access any other parts of the data. That's not a bad way to go. So, but I don't want to think that way. So what I want to do here is I'm going to add in a new opportunity to override the default abilities here. So we have await set. So at the moment, entities the way it is, this is still functionally correct. Nothing unique about that. But what I do want to consider here is I call this selected entities. And the reason I'm going to do this here once again is I want to pass this responsibility up to the parent controller so that it can handle the way it needs to modify that data. So we'll do this. Entities handler. I could also call this get handler. It's nothing wrong with that as well. Okay, entities. All right. Now, it's asking us to create that, so I'm going to go ahead and create this. Now, it always creates it as a private, but what we want is a protected virtual, and remember the virtual so that we can override the default functionality of it. So, with that, and it's going to be returning an enumerable object. Now, some people may be saying, oh, that's not type safe and all the rest, but really for what we're aiming for and the usages that you will be generally trying to accomplish with this will be safe enough for your purposes. If you need it to be more safe, you'll probably upgrade to another method of doing this. However, this is a really good way to do it, and it's safe enough for what we're trying to accomplish. Now, the default behavior, because what I can do, as I mentioned before, is that I can have it very simply select something like this. So it's always going to give me, at minimum, just the ID. Okay, so if it gives me just the ID, I can be okay with that. That means that anytime someone calls get, it will minimum give me a list of IDs. If I don't have anything up at my parent controller, that'll be okay. So let's consider that as a solution here. All right, we'll move on to the get by ID feature. Now let's look at get by ID. Now this in the context of what we did before with our companies, we can copy this out And again, when we were thinking about this, we thought about ahead about our naming conventions so that we didn't have anything that was going to be specific to the use of, in the case of companies, it should be very easy for us to upgrade and make these changes. So what I do want to do is, once again, I can intercept how this will function. All right. So what I can say is very similar in the way that we did with handler with entities handler. We can call this entity handler or even DTO handler, something like that. Um, let's do var DTO entity. And again, one of the things that I don't like doing often, and it does come up that you have to do it. You might have to create specific DTO classes so that you can pass down data from the entities into a data transfer object. Um, I kind of like doing that, but I kind of don't like doing that. And I'm going to show you how to avoid some of that disruption. So I'm going to call this entity handler, and I'm going to pass in entity. And it's going to be very, very similar. All we're really doing is, in fact, copying this, removing the entities, and we're going to call this, it's going to come in as a T, not as a I queryable. And let's just change that, entity. And once again, what we can do is we can do entity dot ID, because we always know we're going to have an ID. And there we have it. So with that, what I do know always is I will always get, at minimum, when I'm asking for the data, I can always get the ID from the object if I just call this with no extra functionality on my controller whatsoever. And that could be handy as well. So there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it gives you some flexibility that if you haven't built more functionality into your parent controller, you're not going to be stuck with no return information or an erroneous return information. So we've got that handled. So let's go back over to our company's API controller. And we're going to take some of this information now. I'm taking over some of the comments. All right. Now, if you remember, we used a JSON document as our input into this, or what we're receiving from the body of our post. I'm going to just delete these comments because they don't actually relate anymore. So with that, we can change our company references to T, because at this point we don't know what they are. This code can be extracted out and placed into a method. And once again, we can call that method. Let's do await post pre-add handler. There we go. I'm going to pass in entity, and I'm going to pass in value. That's our JSON document. Okay. And let's just generate that. So, very similar to what we have done before. Protected, virtual, so that we can override it. And in this case, this is essentially what we might see as an opportunity to happen up in the parent level. Now, we can't do a whole lot at this point in this, but we would actually physically have to go up to the parent level because the parent has anything that we would actually need to change. We wouldn't be changing the ID at this point other than creating an ID, but we really don't need to do that either. The other thing that we are doing is extracting specific things for the model that it knows, the parent knows all about, but our generic doesn't know anything about that. Okay, next one, what I'll do here is we can return, let's see, we're going to do our post add, we do an add again, and why don't we do one more thing, just like we did with um, our view controller. We could, this is going to be post, a little confusing, post add handler, and in this case all we're doing here is passing in the entity. Now it's just a little bit more steps that we're adding here, and again the reason is just a little more versatility that if there's a reason to modify something after the object has been added, which there's sometimes reason for doing that, and I've definitely had a reason for doing that, but we'll just have it there as an opportunity to be used. So we can take away this not implemented exception, and I think we're pretty good. At this point, we want to do another little modification. Okay, so we're going to say this is new entity, or let's call it DTO entity, just to be consistent. DTO entity equals new entity dot ID. Okay, and essentially what we're doing here is this. Okay, but as you can see, this isn't going to work very well. So what we're actually trying to accomplish here is the same thing that we did up here, entity handler. And with entity handler, in this case, it's a post entity handler, basically does the same thing, but we can copy it and probably do precisely the same thing. We could even post, like, hand the responsibility up to the entity handler once more, and just do it like that. So I could easily do entity handler, whoop, entity handler, and entity. That way I'm able to reuse some of the code. Oops, that's entities handler. That's why it's giving me trouble there. There we are. So at the moment, the base responsibility of post entity handler just passes it right up to entity handler, and we don't need to think about that. So in this way, instead of doing this little manual jig here, we can just do something like that. Okay, and that way we're extracting the DTO in the controller, passing it back, and then using it as our return value. Okay, so this is pretty good. We're getting we're making some headway on this, and we'll move on to the put. So this is updating our entity. So let's move that over. Now, from here, we are receiving an ID as the parameter, first of all, and we don't know what ID that is, so this is going to be T key. We're also receiving a JSON value once more. We're checking for the ID. Now you can see we've hard-coded ID into here. What we would actually want to do is something more like this. We use the name of operator, and we can look up the identity of T key dot ID. So very simply, all that's going to do is just translating ID into a string. That's all. But if I ever decide to change ID to something else, it'll reflect over here, and I really don't have to think about replacing strings everywhere. Okay. So, and as I mentioned, one of the things that I will probably do at some point in another video is add a few extensions that simplify some of this code. It's pretty ugly, so I don't really appreciate that so much, but we'll move on. Now, what we're doing here is we're saying if ID is not equal to the model ID, we're going to pass a bad request. Next, we will go down to here. So we obviously have to make a change on this one. So we are going to do a similar thing that we've done before. This is going to be put post find handler. I'm doing pre and post. If you're following me there, it's not HTTP verbs. And let's see, post handler, and we want to also pass in our JSON document. So let's go ahead and create that method. So it'll be very similar to this one up here. I'm going to copy that, in fact, because I know it is entirely similar, if not exact. And we'll take away that. And essentially what it's doing is the same thing that was there before. So now we can get rid of this code. All right. The next thing that we need to do, because essentially these two functions do exactly the same thing, other than the return value, that is, and I will make an adjustment to that. Our return value is still going to be okay, but we're going to return the DTO entity and remove our created at. Okay, so that's it for these functions in our API user controller. The next step that we want to look at, and I'll just make sure that we've got everything right. I think we're pretty good here. Yes. All right, the next step we're going to do is move into our delete. Now delete, again, fairly straightforward, fairly simple. There's not a lot of interjection that has to happen here. We have our T key, and I'm going to... Now what we're going to do here is we're going to modify this from asking for the whether the ID is null or empty based on a string, because we really don't know what it's going to be. So what I will do is I'll do ID dot equals default Okay, so that is fundamentally correct. It's not necessary to do that, if you will. However, if ID is the default or null, we want to also manage if it's null or equal to default. Okay, I could replace this through a few other things, but I'm not going to at this moment. So all we're doing at this time is replacing, we're just simply qualifying whether ID is null or the default. Next, we go down and ask for the entity. If the entity is null, we say it's not found. If it is found, we go ahead and delete it and then save the changes, return OK. Pretty straightforward so far. Let's go ahead and save that. Now, we haven't done any implementations at this point, so what we can do now is we can create another company's controller and work with the root of that. So let's do, we'll just call this company's controller companies to controller. Make it very creative. Companies to controller. And it's going to inherit base API user controller, and it's going to take in a few things here. Now, if I recall, I think we created a generic one that was specific to our application, and there it is, API user control. That's why it was asking me for so much stuff. And this is going to be companies or company, and the company repository is the repository here, and the company key is string. This is just complaining because it doesn't know where company is. We'll make sure that we have that. And from here we'll adjust our constructor. All right. Now, companies 2 also requires authorize, and we need to use our API policy. So with this, we pretty much have what we need to get going, with the exception of, and I mentioned this before, because with the exception of overriding some of those handlers. If you recall, the way we've set this up at the moment is it's only always going to return the ID no matter what it is, so I can have this very minimal view of companies without having any kind of interaction. So let's give this a shot here. We'll see if what we have is still enough to make this work. All right, our application is up and running. Let's go ahead and take a look. Now, companies, let's just see what companies gives us. It looks like this. Our new companies 2, what does it give us without anything interaction? One of the things that we forgot to do here is convert over to, we didn't want to return views. We want to return our OK. And, you pesky devil. There we go. Let's try that one more time. All right, we're going to try this one more time here. Let's go to our companies 2, and there we have it. We have exactly what we were expecting. We only received the ID back if there is no intervention from the controller. Pretty good so far. Let's add a few more features to our company's controller, and then I'm going to wrap up for the day. So let's do the entities handler. And from this, once again, we have to make this an async. And so entities is select new, and we're going to take our ID and name, and that should be everything we need. Let's try this out. Okay, let's head over to companies 2 again, and everything worked exactly the way we were expecting. We overrode the default actions of returning only ID, and now we have ID and name. So at this point here with our companies 2 controller, we also have a few reasons to override things for the post and put options. All right. Now, one of the things that we had to do is extract information from the JSON document and inject it into our entity. So why don't we go ahead and do some of that? We also have an override for the entity handler, and it'll be very similar to this. All we have to do is very simply return, oops, I gotta make that an async, and we just return entity dot ID comma entity dot name. And again, for your purposes, you may want to make this more specific or have something that's much more broad, but we only have these two features on our entity at the moment. Okay, so the next thing that I'm aiming for here is what do we do in the case of overriding the pre-add function for our post? So we called this post pre-add, all right? And if I go back over to my API controller, we have this. This is the post pre-add handler. It takes two parameters. One is company, one is the JSON document. And I'm going to go over and copy this code that I commented out and just paste it right in here. This is also an async, so we're not returning anything either. So at this point, what I'm doing is I am extracting the name from the JSON document and feeding that name into the entity. Pretty straightforward. Again, nothing complicated there at all. So let's go ahead and do a little more. Almost made the same mistake again there. So let's see, post. We have the entity handler, and this is also something important. So what we can do, and as I mentioned before, I am handling the entity handler very simply by doing this. Okay, I'm going to pass that responsibility back up to the entity handler. That way I don't have to do anything special to it, but I could in this case if for example I really need my my entity to have more detail. That could happen as well. All right, now the next thing that we have is our put handler. So let's move on with some of that. Our put post find handler. So this is after we find the information we need. And in this case, once again, really all I have to do is reuse the functionality in the post pre-add handler. Just like that. Let's just be sure we're doing this the way we need to. We don't actually need to return anything. We're just passing the information through. So that pushes it up to here. It then does all the replacements that it needs and then comes back down. We have nothing to handle with regards to the ID because that's handled on the database. And any other functions that we would need to set at this point, or not functions, but properties that we would need to set, can be set right in here. Okay. Let's just double check and see if there's anything else that we need to do. In the meantime here, we've handled this. Our DTO is the next thing that we have, so let's do that. Override put. Oh, let's just see here. I don't think we've got this as virtual. Do we have it as virtual? Let's see. Ah, okay, I made a mistake here. Let's fix that. Put in the new method here, and we'll ensure that we actually use it. Now, if you recall, in this case, all we have to do is, by default, we can handle it using the post entity handler, or put entity handler in this case. Let's see, post entity handler, and that will handle converting it to just have the this as the default. So let's just see here. Where do we have that? Okay, we can handle it by using post entity handler. That then hands it up to entity handler So by default, it's still kind of doing exactly the same thing that it did before. We also need a couple things here to make this one work. There we go. So we have a task of object, and for some reason that didn't actually translate over. And there we are. Okay. So long story short, what we did here is we just added in a new method called putEntityHandler. I noticed that because when I went to try to use it in my company's controller, I couldn't use it at that point. So now we do have it. And once again, I can pass that handler up to postHandler, just the same as I did before. PostHandler. And await post handler, and of course entity handler handles it's the post handler is again. But what we do want to do is just make sure that it does what it's supposed to. So it's always going to return the ID and name as we expect. So that's pretty awesome. We're getting that now, and let's be sure that we're actually doing what we need to do here. I think we're pretty good. So let's test this in Postman. Okay, so we're in Postman, and what I've got is a set of endpoints that are already set up just like I've done before. And from this, what I'm going to run is my post, my put, my get by ID, and then delete. So with this, I'm going to run the post method. We can create a company without any trouble. It shows that we've created it. We have the name that we've designated here in the body. We just simply have to go in and send it, and we will update the name as we need to. When we go into our get, we'll also get a very similar response with get, and we do send, and then we can find it. This is where it was previously, but there will be something new, and it's right here. There we have it. Testing, testing. And then, of course, we want to test our get by ID. We'll make sure that is still working the way it's supposed to. And we have that working, and then we're going to run a delete. And let's go ahead and send that. Excellent. So all of our functions work here just fine. We have no issues with our new API controller, which is pretty awesome. I'm pretty happy with what this is showing, and I think that we can wrap up our video from here. Thanks for watching, everyone. Remember to like and subscribe. I love you all, so please remember to share these videos. Tell everybody about it if you like them. And as well, give me some comments. Give me something useful that I can work with. If I've made a mistake or if there's something that you feel could have been done better, I'd love to hear about it. But be kind and be gentle when you're doing it. Thanks a lot. Bye.